Thanks, Corinne. John, the NATO summit is just a few weeks away. How have the events of this past weekend in any way changed or modified the agenda for the NATO summit?
I think it's, again, too soon here. This just happened over the weekend. So I think I'd be fibbing to you if I told you that there was some sort of big agenda item changed because of what happened over the weekend. We'll have to see how this plays out. It's just too soon to know what the impacts are. It's going to be an important NATO summit regardless, because we are now, almost a year and a half into war here in Ukraine. We've got a new NATO member in Finland, and hopefully soon a 32nd member. So there's an awful lot on the agenda to speak to, and it's a critical time for the alliance. The president's looking forward to it.
Does the administration subscribe to the view, as it relates to Russian leadership, who essentially leads that country, that the devil you know is better than the devil that you don't know?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but let me tack it this way, and if I'm wrong...
I can try a little bit.
Okay, because you lost me there a little bit on the devil stuff.
Well, I'm sorry to get into that. I was just simply saying, would you prefer to have Vladimir Putin leading Russia, or an entity like the Wagner Group, or someone named from the Wagner Group leading the Russian government?
We believe it's up to the Russian people to determine who their leadership is, and we would prefer to see Russia not invade their neighboring countries. We would prefer to see Russia, since they already did that, remove all their troops from Ukraine and end the war today, which they could do. That's what we prefer.
Justin.
Thanks. John, you said a number of times you've declined to comment on Putin's grip on power in Russia by saying it's an internal Russian matter. Is that a deliberate decision by the U.S. government to avoid contributing to the notion that the U.S. was somehow behind this, or does the White House simply not have an assessment at this moment of his grip on power?
We're just not going to involve ourselves in speaking to an internal domestic Russian issue right now. We're staying focused on supporting Ukraine. And I just want to disavow you of any idea that the reason why we're saying we weren't involved has something to do with not wanting to comment about the situation in Moscow and Mr. Putin's leadership. It was important to say it on the face of it, that we weren't involved, and we have no intention of being involved. What we are going to be involved in is supporting Ukraine.
And then there's been Brent crude increase this morning. There was higher European natural gas prices. How closely is the administration monitoring potential energy price shocks as a result of instability in Russia?
Been watching it since the beginning of the war, actually before the beginning of the war, and we'll continue to do that.
April.
John, I want to kind of get into the weeds off of Jeff's question on weakness. Are you concerned about the instability in Russia because of the nuclear capability? If they have to come out stronger, they could use that. Is that the reason for your concern about instability?
I think you got to take a broader view of that, April. I mean, the reason we would be concerned about instability in Russia is the war in Ukraine predominantly. Yes, Russia's a nuclear power, and yes, that's of concern, and yes, we continue to monitor that. But I mean, I just think if you look at the scope of recent events, again, over the past year and a half, there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about stability in Russia and the impact that could have on the Ukrainian people and on the European continent.
And as you said, over the last year and a half, going back to what Jeff said, this administration acknowledged that they were shocked that it took Russia so long. They have not shown to be the power, the military might that everyone thought they were. And then what happens this weekend, does it show cracks in Russia's military might and who they are as we perceive them?
Yeah, again, we're not going to characterize the events of the weekend or be able to contextualize it for you beyond what we've said before. It's just too soon to know what impacts this is going to have on Ukraine and on Russia, quite frankly, throughout Europe. It's just too soon to know. But broadly speaking, I mean, we're now in 16 months of war, a war that was advertised by the Russian side as only going to be taking a few days. And now we're 16 months into it. Clearly, you don't need me to tell you, but the history of this conflict has shown that the Russian military is not as vaunted as perhaps they wanted to characterize themselves as. But, and this is a big but, and I think it's an important point to make, as Ukraine conducts offensive operations this summer to claw back some of that territory. They are running into a Russian defense. And the Russians have invested in those defensive capabilities. And so, as I said in my opening statement, casualties are being taken on both sides. There's a lot of active fighting right now in the east and the south of the country. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but what we're trying to do is make sure that the Ukrainians have everything they need to be successful in that fight.